As I stepped through the heavy oak doors of the family courtroom, the air seemed to instantly freeze. The room was grand, lined with dark wood, and filled with the suffocating silence of legal proceedings. My daughter Victoria leaned back in her leather chair and let out a soft, mocking laugh that echoed off the high ceiling. Beside her, my son-in-law, Derek, quickly turned his head. He stared down at the polished floor, completely refusing to meet my eyes. They sat there radiating arrogance. They genuinely thought they had won. They thought the frail 70-year-old man walking slowly down the aisle was completely at their mercy, ready to be stripped of his rights. But then the presiding judge looked up from his thick stack of paperwork. Judge Richard Montgomery. Our eyes met, instantly. His face drained of all color, turning ashen. The heavy wooden pen slipped from his fingers and clattered loudly against the mahogany desk. His hands were visibly trembling as he whispered into the dead, silent room. My God, is that really him? Every single eye in the courtroom shifted toward me. The arrogant smirk on Victoria's face vanished. Derek finally looked up, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. In that exact moment, the ugly truth hit my daughter like a physical blow. No one in her entitled, greedy little world knew who I truly was until today. If you are watching this, I want you to take a deep breath, because the story of how my own flesh and blood tried to legally erase me from existence might just shake your faith in family entirely. Please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you are watching from. It gives this 70-year-old man a lot of comfort to know someone out there is listening to my truth. Now, let me take you back to how this nightmare actually began. It started exactly 3 weeks before that dramatic courtroom showdown. I was living a quiet, isolated, and peaceful life on my 50-acre farm just outside of Lexington, Kentucky. After my beautiful wife Patty passed away from breast cancer a few years ago, the farm became my only sanctuary. We had purchased this sprawling land together decades ago, making a solemn promise to leave it untouched. It was our safe haven, a beautiful green escape away from the endless noise and greed of the city. I spent my lonely mornings tending to my loyal golden retriever, Buster, planting tomatoes and fixing up old rusty tractors in the barn. I truly thought I had paid my dues to society. I thought I had earned my peace. But peace is a very fragile thing when your own family starts looking at you not as a grieving father, but as a walking, breathing bank account, waiting to be emptied. It was a crisp Tuesday afternoon when the loud crunch of gravel in my driveway broke the silence of the farm. Victoria and Derek arrived completely unannounced in their sleek, brand-new black SUV. They did not come with groceries or warm hugs. They marched up the wooden porch steps with the cold, calculated efficiency of ruthless debt collectors. Before I could even ask how their drive was or offer them a cup of warm coffee, Victoria reached into her designer handbag and tossed a thick, heavy stack of papers right onto my kitchen table. The envelopes were torn open, the documents stamped with aggressive red ink, past due notices, final warnings from the electric company, the local water board, and the county property tax office. I looked down at the threatening papers, and then I slowly looked up at my daughter. Victoria stepped forward and placed her hand on my shoulder. She used a sickly, sweet, incredibly patronizing tone that immediately made my stomach turn into knots. "Dad, you forgot to pay the electricity again," she said, sighing dramatically, as if I were a burden she was graciously carrying. "The water bill is 2 months late now. Your memory is really slipping, is it not? We are getting so worried about you living out here all alone in the middle of nowhere. You could hurt yourself. We just want to help you manage things before you get the power shut off and freeze in the dark," Derek chimed in. leaning casually against the kitchen doorframe with a smug, arrogant smirk plastered across his face. "Yeah, Harrison," he said, not even bothering to call me Dad. "It is a whole lot for an old guy to keep track of these days. Maybe it is time we step in and officially handle your finances. You know, take the heavy burden off your aging shoulders so you can just relax." I stared down at the overdue bills resting on my table. I did not argue with them. I did not yell or act defensive. Instead, I simply let my hands shake just a little bit. I played the exact part of the confused, helpless, deteriorating old man they desperately wanted me to be. I rubbed my temples, let out a shaky sigh, and muttered a quiet, embarrassed apology. But inside my head, a massive, deafening alarm bell was ringing. You see, Victoria and Derek knew me as a loving father and a retired, boring government employee who liked to garden. What they conveniently ignored or simply never bothered to understand was what I actually did for the federal government. For 35 years, I was a senior forensic auditor for the Department of Justice. I spent my entire career hunting down hidden offshore accounts, unspooling massive webs of corporate fraud, and testifying against the most dangerous financial criminals in the country. I have an eidetic memory for numbers. I can still recall the exact routing digits of shell companies from Mafia, cases I worked 2 entire decades ago. Looking at those bills, I knew with absolute terrifying certainty that they were already paid. I had written the checks myself on the 4th day of the month. I remembered the exact amounts down to the penny. $7,420 for the water, $112.15 for the electricity. The bills sitting on my table were real documents, but they were duplicates. They had likely intercepted them from my mailbox before my physical checks were processed, or simply printed them out from an online portal they had secretly gained access to. My own daughter was looking me right in the eyes and lying straight to my face. She was trying to establish a false narrative. She was intentionally planting the psychological seeds of dementia, actively building a fake paper trail to document my supposed mental incompetence. Why was she doing this? I did not know the full answer yet, but as a man who spent his entire adult life dismantling complex criminal conspiracies, I knew a setup when I saw one. I nodded slowly, thanking them for their deep concern, watching out of the corner of my eye as they exchanged a victorious secret glance. They thought they were playing me. They thought I was easy prey. But the retired prosecutor inside me had just woken up, and the hunt had officially begun. The days following their unexpected visit took on a strange, unsettling rhythm. If you live alone, you know exactly where everything in your house belongs. You develop muscle memory for your own life. My glasses always sat on the console. My newspaper was always stacked beside my coffee mug. Suddenly, the geography of my home shifted. It started with the mail. I was expecting my tax assessment, a document I filed away meticulously. It simply never arrived. Or rather, it arrived and vanished from the counter. 2 days later, my car keys disappeared. I searched the entire house. I found them buried at the bottom of the laundry hamper, a place I had no reason to put them. I stared at those keys resting against dirty shirts. Any normal person might have panicked. They might wonder if their mind was failing. But I did not panic. I felt the cold logic of my career clicking into gear. Someone had been inside my house. Victoria still had the spare key I gave her for emergencies. She was using it to deliberately unravel my reality. The depth of their cruelty became apparent on a Thursday afternoon. I went outside to tend to Patty's rose bushes. It was a ritual that kept her memory alive. I reached for her garden tell. It was always kept on the second shelf of the shed. It was gone. I tore the shed apart. I scoured the garden beds. The trowel was missing. That evening, Victoria and Derek dropped by claiming they were checking on me. When I mentioned the missing trowel, Victoria gasped in theatrical concern. "Oh, Dad," she said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "You probably left it in the yard. You know how easily distracted you get these days." Derek shook his head, letting out an exaggerated sigh. He walked over to the window. "Harrison, buddy," he muttered, keeping his back to me. "This is getting serious. First the bills, then your keys, and now things of sentimental value. You are becoming a danger to yourself. What if you leave the stove on next time? What if you wander off and forget your way back?" I looked at the two of them standing in my living room, coordinating a psychological assault against me. The urge to practically shout that I knew exactly what they were doing burned in my chest. But a good investigator never reveals his hand until the trap is fully closed. So, I gave them the tragic performance they came for. I let my tired shoulders slump. I stared down at the floor, rubbing my weathered hands together nervously. I let my voice waver just enough to sound weak and fragile. "You might be right," I whispered, looking up at Victoria with wide, highly vulnerable eyes. "I just do not know what is happening to my old head lately. Everything feels so hazy and foggy." Victoria stepped forward and wrapped her arms tightly around me. It was a hollow, lifeless embrace. "Do not worry, Dad," she cooed gently, patting my back as if I were a highly frightened toddler. "We are going to take excellent care of you. We are going to make sure you are totally safe." When they finally left, the house felt extremely heavy with the lingering residue of their lies. I walked slowly into the kitchen to pour myself a cold glass of water, and that is when I saw it, resting perfectly in the center of the kitchen island, right where I could not possibly miss it, was a glossy, thick brochure. I picked it up. The cover featured a group of smiling, silver-haired elders playing chess on a bright sunlit patio. Oak Creek Luxury Assisted Living. I opened the crisp pages. It detailed 24-hour medical surveillance, secure memory care units, and full comprehensive lifestyle management. Victoria had not left it there by accidental mistake. It was a carefully calculated seed she was eagerly planting in my supposedly decaying mind. She wanted me to look at this shiny brochure and feel a sense of relief. She wanted me to simply surrender to the false idea that I was broken and desperately needed a gilded cage. I stood all alone in the dim light of my kitchen, holding the glossy paper as all the desperate puzzle pieces violently snapped together. The deliberately misplaced keys, the stolen mail, the fake unpaid bills, the stolen trowel, and now this highly specific assisted living brochure. It was not just a basic, greedy grab for my retirement bank accounts. They were meticulously building a highly documented, observable history of severe mental decline. They were purposely setting the strict legal stage for a permanent conservatorship. Victoria was planning to go before a judge and officially declare her elderly father legally incompetent. If she won, she would instantly gain absolute unrestricted control over my finances, my personal medical decisions, and most importantly, my 50 acres of prime real estate. She would easily have the absolute power to lock me away in a secure memory care ward and effortlessly sell off the sacred land Patty and I had promised to strictly protect forever. I tossed the brochure onto the granite counter. I did not feel weak or frail. I did not feel lost or confused. My analytical mind was considerably sharper than it had been in several long years. I knew their entire endgame now, and my seasoned gut told me they were going to drastically escalate their deceptive tactics if I did not submit quickly enough. The passive-aggressive comments and purposely stolen garden tools were merely just the beginning. They were ultimately going to forcefully force my hand, and I actively decided right then and there, standing completely still in the quiet of my home. that I was going to gladly let them try. I would play the highly helpless victim, carefully dragging them deeper and deeper into their own trap until they crossed the final line. The morning air carried the scent of pine and damp earth, a comfort that usually brought me peace. Buster, my golden retriever, bounded down the wooden steps with his usual enthusiasm. He was the last living piece of my life with Patty. His bright eyes and wagging tail were my anchor. I watched him sniff around the old oak tree, content in our isolation. I turned my back for a moment to pour a fresh cup of coffee. The silence of the farm was profound until it was suddenly shattered by a sound that made my blood run cold. It was a harsh, agonizing hacking noise coming from the front yard. I dropped my ceramic mug, watching it shatter across the floor, and sprinted out the door. Buster was swaying unsteadily near the edge of the driveway. His golden coat was matted with sweat. Before I could reach him, his hind legs gave out completely. He collapsed onto the hard gravel, his body convulsing as he began to vomit violently. A thick foam gathered around his muzzle, and his breathing became a series of ragged gasps. I dropped to my knees, ignoring the sharp stones, and pulled his heavy head into my lap. I smoothed his ears, whispering his name, trying to soothe the panic radiating from his eyes. As I frantically reached for my phone to call the clinic, the sound of tires crunching on gravel echoed down the driveway. Victoria and Derek were pulling up in their black vehicle. Their arrival was entirely too convenient. It was a Tuesday morning, a time they normally dedicated to their busy schedules in the city. Yet, here they were, stepping out with expressions that lacked any genuine surprise. Derek walked over with a deliberate pace, crossing his arms over his chest as he looked down at my suffering companion. He did not kneel to help. He did not ask what was wrong. Instead, he let out a heavy sigh of fake frustration, shaking his head slowly. "See, Dad," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "This is exactly what we have been warning you about. You are so confused lately that you probably fed the dog your own blood pressure medication." I stared up at him, my hands trembling as I held Buster close. I knew my medication was locked away safely in the bathroom cabinet. Buster had no access to it. But Derek continued his calculated assault, his eyes completely devoid of empathy. "You cannot even take care of an animal anymore. Harrison, you are mixing up your pills, losing your belongings, and now this poor creature is paying the price for your cognitive decline. It is honestly sad to watch." Victoria stepped forward, positioning herself beside her husband. She looked down at me with a practiced expression of sorrowful concern. Her voice was soft, but her words were sharp and commanding. "Dad, we cannot let this continue," she murmured, keeping a safe distance from the mess on the ground. "We have tried to be patient. We have tried to give you space, but you are clearly slipping away from us. This situation with Buster is a massive wake-up call. What if you leave the gas on next? What if you take the wrong medication yourself? We need to step in before someone gets killed." She reached into her leather bag and pulled out a thick manila envelope. "I have spoken to our legal team," she continued smoothly, as if discussing the weather rather than stripping away my human rights. "They have drafted the paperwork for a medical and financial power of attorney. It is temporary, just until we can get you settled into a safe facility where professionals can monitor your daily needs. You need to sign these documents today. We cannot leave you alone." I looked down at Buster, whining softly in pain, and then back up at the two people standing over me. The sheer audacity of their plan was staggering. They had deliberately harmed an innocent animal just to force a narrative of my incompetence. The rage brewing inside my chest was a living, breathing entity, but I forced it down into the darkest corners of my mind. I let a single tear roll down my weathered cheek. I allowed my lower lip to quiver, I nodded slowly, looking absolutely defeated and entirely broken. "You might be right," I whispered, my voice cracking perfectly. "I am so sorry. I do not know what I did. I will look at the papers. Just please let me take care of my boy first. Let me save my dog." Victoria smiled a terrifyingly satisfied smirk that she quickly tried to hide. "We will leave the documents on the kitchen counter." "Dad," she said softly, "we will come back tonight to pick them up. Do not worry at all. We have everything under control." I stayed on the gravel, holding Buster crying as they walked back to their vehicle. I listened to the heavy doors slam shut and the engine roar to life. I did not move a single muscle until the sound of their tires faded down the country road, leaving me alone in the profound silence of the farm. The second they were gone, the tears stopped. My trembling hands became rock steady. I gently wiped the foam from Buster's mouth. The frail, broken old man they had just spoken to evaporated into thin air, replaced by the forensic investigator who had dismantled criminal empires. My eyes went entirely dead and cold. I did not waste another single second. I scooped my lethargic dog into my arms, standing up with a strength that would have shocked my daughter. They thought they had backed me into a corner. They thought poisoning my dog would break my spirit and force me to hand over the keys to my entire life. But they had made a fatal miscalculation. They had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and I was going to make them deeply regret this wicked game. I laid Buster across the back seat of my old truck, covering him with a woolen blanket. I drove fast, bypassing the local veterinarian in town. Victoria had likely called them already, planting her story about a senile father who accidentally poisoned his pet. I could not risk trusting anyone close by. Instead, I drove 45 minutes across the county line to see Dr. Henry Wallace. Henry was an old friend, a no-nonsense country vet who had treated Patty's rescue horses years ago. He was discreet, thorough, and entirely untethered from the gossip of my local community. When I pulled up to his small clinic, I carried Buster inside, my jaw clenched so tight my teeth ached. Henry took one look at the dog's pale gums and labored breathing and immediately called his technicians. They rushed Buster into the back treatment room, hooking him up to intravenous fluids and drawing multiple vials of blood. I paced the small, sterile waiting area. The smell of antiseptic stung my nose, bringing back a flood of unwelcome memories from hospital waiting rooms during Patty's final days. After what felt like an eternity, Henry emerged from the double-swinging doors. He pulled off his surgical gloves, his expression grim and heavily lined with concern. "He is stable for now, Harrison," Henry said, his voice dropping to a serious, hushed tone. "But we caught it just in time. His kidney function was dropping rapidly." I leaned against the counter, releasing a heavy breath. I told him I needed to know exactly what caused it. I asked him directly if it was human blood pressure medication, just to rule out the absurd narrative my daughter had constructed. Henry frowned, shaking his head firmly. "No," he stated unequivocally. "It was absolutely not blood pressure medication. The initial blood panel showed a massive spike in specific enzymes that are unmistakable. This was ethylene glycol poisoning. It was anti-Rees Harrison. And given his size and the progression of the symptoms, it was not a massive dose. It was a small, calculated amount, just enough to make him violently ill, but perhaps not enough to kill him instantly." The words hung in the quiet air of the clinic. Antifreeze, a small, calculated amount. It was an incredibly sweet-tasting poison that any dog would gladly lap up if it were mixed into their morning food bowl. I thanked Henry, paid the emergency bill in cash, and asked him to keep Buster for overnight observation. I told him I needed a full certified toxicology report printed on his official clinic letterhead. Henry nodded, sensing the dark gravity of the situation without asking unnecessary questions. I walked out of the clinic and sat behind the steering wheel of my truck. I did not start the engine immediately. I just sat there gripping the leather steering wheel until my knuckles turned completely white. I stared out through the dusty windshield, but I did not see the quiet country road. I saw the faces of the men I used to hunt. During my time at the Department of Justice, I tracked down financial operators for major international cartels. These were ruthless men who built vast empires on blood and coercion. I remembered a specific case from 1998. A cartel enforcer wanted to intimidate a stubborn bank manager into laundering money. He did not send a threatening letter. He did not make a phone call. He poisoned the manager's champion racehorse, leaving it to suffer slowly in the stable. It was a precise, calculated act of psychological terror. It was designed to break the victim's spirit, to create a profound sense of helplessness, and to vividly demonstrate that their safe boundaries had been entirely breached. Now, 25 years later, I was looking at the exact same predatory playbook, but this time, it was not a cartel hitman employing these psychological terror tactics. It was my own daughter. It was the little girl I had taught to ride a bicycle. It was the child Patty had sung to sleep every single night. Victoria and Derek were so utterly desperate to seize control of my assets that they were entirely willing to torture an innocent, loving animal. They wanted to manufacture a crisis to publicly prove I was a danger to myself and others. They were actively constructing a flawless legal case against my sanity, and they did not care who had to suffer to complete their narrative. A profound shift occurred within me. The deep, agonizing sorrow of a betrayed father completely evaporated. It was instantly replaced by the cold, calculating detachment of a seasoned federal prosecutor preparing for a massive trial. I realized then that I was no longer dealing with a misguided family dispute. I was dealing with hostile, malicious adversaries who operated without any moral boundaries. They had falsely assumed that my age equated to weakness. They firmly believed that my silence was a clear sign of mental decay. They had eagerly stepped into the ring, expecting to easily knock out a confused, defenseless old man. I turned the ignition key, the engine roaring to life with a deep rumble. I pulled out of the clinic parking lot, my mind racing with operational strategies. The game of playing the confused victim was officially over. It was time to transition from passive observation to active, aggressive defense. I needed to map out their entire network. I needed to uncover exactly what was driving their sudden, vicious desperation. People do not usually resort to such extreme high-risk measures unless they are facing a catastrophic threat themselves. I needed to find their vulnerability. The retired prosecutor was fully awake now. The meticulous, relentless investigator had returned. I drove back toward the farm, mentally preparing for the war ahead. The hunt had officially begun. The journey back to my empty house was a fast, calculating blur of tactical planning. The winding country roads offered me ample time to strategize my next immediate moves. I knew that the moment I stepped through my front door, I would be entering a deeply compromised environment. Victoria and Derek had already proven they possessed a key and a complete willingness to violate my sanctuary without a second thought. If I wanted to catch them in the act, I needed eyes and ears that they could not possibly see. I did not drive straight home to the farm. Instead, I took a long detour to a specialized electronics retailer located deep in the gritty industrial district of a neighboring city. The owner of the shop was a former military intelligence contractor I had crossed paths with decades ago during a massive federal sting operation. I paid entirely in cash, purchasing an expensive array of military-grade surveillance equipment. I bought dozens of micro-cameras no larger than the head of a pin. Multiple high-fidelity audio bugs, perfectly designed to pick up faint whispers, right through solid drywall and a highly localized, heavily encrypted router system. When I finally pulled my truck into my gravel driveway, the sun was dipping far below the horizon, casting long, dark shadows across the wooden porch. Victoria's black vehicle was already parked aggressively near the barn. They had boldly let themselves in, undoubtedly searching for more documents or preparing their next staged incident to prove my mind was failing. I walked heavily through the front door, carrying the expensive equipment concealed in a weathered canvas duffel bag, slung casually over my aching shoulder. Derek was sitting comfortably in my favorite armchair, scrolling endlessly through his phone while Victoria was rummaging through a tall stack of mail in the kitchen. I immediately slipped right back into my carefully crafted, fragile persona. I purposefully slumped my shoulders, let my hands tremble slightly, and sighed a deep, exhausted breath. I told them the long, highly stressful day at the veterinary clinic had completely drained my fragile energy. I muttered something totally incoherent about needing to rest my aching bones and walked slowly toward the master bedroom. Victoria followed me closely to the door, her voice dripping with that same fake patronizing sweetness. She told me to sleep well and promised they would stay in the living room to keep a watchful eye over me. I thanked her, closed my heavy bedroom door, and locked it quietly. I lay fully clothed on the mattress, waiting patiently in the dark. I listened intensely to the muffled sounds of their hushed voices bleeding upward through the floorboards. I waited for over 3 excruciating hours, maintaining absolute stillness. Finally, the house grew completely silent. I slipped out of bed, moving with the silent, deliberate precision I had originally learned during my early field days. I opened the canvas duffel bag and laid out the surveillance tools. I started directly in the living room, creeping silently past where Derek was dozing lightly on the sofa. My heart beat steadily with calculated purpose. I embedded a tiny camera inside the hollow base of a decorative wooden clock sitting on the mantel. I placed a highly sensitive audio bug securely beneath the heavy oak coffee table. In the kitchen, I unscrewed the faceplate of a high wall outlet, slipping a wide-angle lens directly behind the plastic casing to perfectly capture the entire room. I moved like a ghost through my own home, wiring the formal dining room, the long hallways, and the private office where I kept my financial filing cabinets locked. I then slipped quietly out the back door into the cool, damp night air. I wired the dark interior of the barn, hiding a camera high up in the wooden rafters, angled perfectly downward to capture absolutely everything below. Finally, I addressed the driveway. I tucked a weatherproof motion-activated lens deep inside the hollowed-out cavity of a decorative stone pillar near the main iron gate. It would seamlessly capture every single license plate and every hushed conspiratorial conversation happening outside their vehicle. Back in the ultimate safety of my locked bedroom, I fired up my laptop to immediately complete the final, most crucial phase of my operation. I connected the localized router to a highly secure, heavily encrypted offshore server based deep in Switzerland. Every single frame of high-definition video and every crystal-clear audio file would be automatically uploaded to a digital vault that absolutely no one in the United States could ever access or legally subpoena without my direct personal authorization. As I watched the live feeds begin to populate across my computer screen, providing a perfect surveillance grid of my entire property, a profound sense of sorrow briefly washed over my weary soul. I stared intently at the grainy green-tinted night vision image of my daughter sleeping peacefully on my sofa. I could not ignore the bitter, agonizing irony of the tragic situation. I had spent my entire professional life using these exact same covert surveillance tactics to definitively dismantle violent mafia syndicates and ruthlessly cunning financial predators. I had built complex federal cases against heartless men who violently destroyed innocent lives for basic profit. Now I was actively deploying those precise counterintelligence measures against my own flesh and blood. I was officially treating my only daughter and her husband like highly organized, dangerous criminals. But as I watched Derek stir in his sleep, vividly remembering the vile, sweet-tasting poison he had casually fed my innocent, trusting dog, my brief sorrow hardened back into solid, impenetrable ice. They were no longer family. They were hostile predators operating freely inside my perimeter, and I was going to meticulously document every single breath they took. I sat in the darkness, illuminated only by the faint glow of the monitors, absolutely ready for whatever lies they planned to spin. The moment the sun came up, casting a pale, cold light across the frost-covered grass of my farm, I was already awake, sitting in the kitchen with a cup of black coffee, waiting for the performance to begin. At precisely 10 o'clock in the morning, Victoria walked through the front door, leading a man I had never seen before. He wore a crisp white coat over a wrinkled blue dress shirt. He carried a sleek leather briefcase, but I immediately noticed his shoes. They were cheap, scuffed at the toes, and completely out of place for a highly paid medical specialist. Victoria introduced him as Dr. Miller, a top-tier neurologist from a private clinic in the city. She used that same patronizing, overly gentle tone, explaining that he was just here for a simple, friendly chat to check on my memory. I knew better. This was not a medical visit. This was a targeted deposition. I nodded slowly, offering a wide, vacant smile, and shuffled my feet as I led them into the living room. I made sure my hands trembled as I took my seat in the worn fabric recliner, pulling a knitted blanket over my knees for dramatic effect. Dr. Miller sat across from me, clicking his expensive pen. He began with the standard basic orientation questions. He asked me what day of the week it was the current month and who the current president of the United States was. I paused, letting a long, agonizing silence stretch across the room. I stared blankly at the floral pattern on the rug, furrowing my brow as if I were desperately searching through a thick, heavy fog. Finally, I gave him the wrong month and named a president from 2 decades ago. Victoria let out a soft, theatrical gasp, placing a comforting hand on Derek's shoulder. Derek simply shook his head, looking down at his phone, as if my supposed mental decay was a terrible inconvenience to his busy schedule. Doctor. Miller jotted down a few quick notes on his clipboard, his expression remaining entirely neutral and detached. He did not look at me with the genuine compassion of a healer. He looked at me like a highly lucrative business transaction that was going perfectly according to plan. Next came the standard cognitive evaluations. The doctor leaned forward and slowly recited 3 simple words for me to remember. Apple, table, penny. He told me he would ask me to repeat them in a few minutes. We continued chatting about my daily routine, and I deliberately fabricated stories about wandering the farm at night and forgetting to feed the animals. When he finally asked me to recall the 3 words, I blinked heavily. I offered him a frustrated, helpless look. I successfully recalled the word apple, but I intentionally stumbled substituting the other 2 with completely unrelated objects. The doctor scribbled furiously. Then he handed me a blank piece of white paper and a pen. He asked me to draw the face of a clock and set the hands to show 10 minutes past 11. This is a classic neurological assessment to detect severe cognitive impairment. I held the pen loosely, letting my hand shake. I slowly drew a lopsided, distorted circle. I bunched all the numbers together on the right side of the page, completely ignoring the left. I drew the hands pointing in random, nonsensical directions. When I handed the paper back, I saw Victoria bite her lower lip to hide a victorious, glowing smile. She had exactly what she came for. She had the visual documented proof that her father was a broken, incompetent shell of a man. "Doctor." Miller packed away his notes, snapping his leather briefcase shut. He stood up and spoke in hushed, serious tones with my daughter near the front hallway. He assured her that the evaluation was completely conclusive. He promised he would quickly expedite the necessary medical certificates to their legal team by the end of the week. Victoria thanked him profusely, playing the part of the grieving, deeply concerned daughter to absolute perfection. Derek opened the front door, offering to walk the good doctor out to his vehicle. I remained in my recliner, staring out the front window with a perfectly blank, vacant expression, watching them disappear down the wooden porch steps. I sat completely motionless until the house was entirely empty and the heavy silence returned. Then I stood up, folding the knitted blanket neatly. My trembling hands became completely still. The thick fog of dementia instantly vanished from my sharp eyes. I waited patiently for nightfall before I retreated into the privacy of my locked office. I turned on my laptop and accessed the encrypted offshore server. I pulled up the high-definition video feed from the driveway camera I had hidden inside the decorative stone pillar the previous night. I rewound the digital footage to the exact moment Derek and the doctor walked out to the expensive luxury vehicle. The dark video image was absolutely crystal clear. I watched as Derek casually leaned against the driver's side door, checking over his shoulder to ensure nobody was watching. He reached deep inside his tailored jacket pocket and pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope. He handed it directly to Dr. Miller. The doctor quickly opened the flap, revealing tight, thick stacks of hundreds. He thumbed through the cash, offered a brief, satisfied nod, and tossed the envelope onto the passenger seat of his car. The medical certificate of incompetence had just been bought and paid for in cold cash. My own family had effectively purchased my complete legal demise right in my very own driveway. I paused the video, staring at the frozen image of Derek handing over the bribe. They thought they had secured a flawless victory, but they had merely handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy their operation. The silent war between us had finally arrived, and I was now completely prepared for it. I did not sleep that night. I kept the frozen image of that bribe on my screen, letting the sheer audacity of their crime burn away any remaining hesitation. Long before the sun breached the horizon, I was already moving. I dressed in dark, unassuming clothing, slipped out the back door, and climbed into my old truck. I left my smartphone resting on the kitchen counter. Victoria had undoubtedly installed tracking software on it under the guise of an emergency family locator. Let her believe I was resting peacefully in my bed. I drove 40 miles away from my farm, crossing into a neighboring county where the rolling green pastures gave way to decaying strip malls and faded asphalt. I found a dimly lit convenience store attached to a rusting gas station. I walked inside, moving past the tired cashier, and paid cash for a cheap, prepaid cellular phone and several activation cards. It was a burner, untraceable, disposable, and entirely invisible to the digital net she thought she had wrapped around me. I walked back out to my truck, the cold morning air biting at my face, and sat behind the steering wheel. I methodically activated the device, listening to the automated prompts, feeling the familiar heavy weight of my old life settling back onto my shoulders. I was no longer a retired widower waiting for the end of his days. I was operating in the shadows again, building a case from the ground up, and I needed an operative who understood exactly how to navigate the dark, treacherous waters of financial espionage. I dialed a number I had committed to memory over a decade ago. It belonged to Benjamin Carter, years before my retirement. Benjamin was a fresh, idealistic rookie at the Department of Justice. I was the senior forensic auditor who took him under my wing. I taught him how to read between the lines of a sanitized ledger, how to crack shell companies, and how to track illicit funds through endless offshore labyrinths. But the heavy bureaucracy of the federal government eventually wore him down. Benjamin left the agency to open his own private intelligence firm. He became a ruthless, highly effective private investigator who specialized in corporate warfare and operated comfortably within the deepest gray areas of the law. He had access to tools, databases, and unsavory contacts that the government simply could not legally touch. He owed me his career, and more importantly, he possessed the exact lack of moral boundaries required for the mission that I was about to assign him. The phone rang 3 times before the line clicked open. There was a brief silence on the other end, just the sound of a man waiting for the caller to speak first. I did not bother introducing myself. I simply said his name. "Harrison," Benjamin said, his voice instantly recognizing the growly tone of his old mentor. "It has been a very long time. I thought you were spending your golden years growing tomatoes and avoiding the rest of society. I did not have the time or the patience for nostalgic pleasantries. The safety of my life and the sanctity of my property were actively under siege. Listen to me very carefully." "Ben," I said, my voice sharp, stripping away any warmth. "I am not calling to catch up. I need you to initiate a comprehensive Level 4 background sweep, and I need it done entirely off the books. No digital footprint, no official inquiries, and absolutely no paper trail." The line grew entirely silent. A Level 4 sweep was our old agency code for a deep illegal level dive. It meant breaching secure financial firewalls, accessing restricted banking nodes, and pulling private communications without a legal warrant. It was a felony just to ask for it. "You know, I do not take those kinds of risks for just anyone," Harrison Benjamin replied, his tone shifting into professional caution. "Who are we looking at?" "Derek Sterling," I answered flatly. "He is the CEO of Sterling Development Group. He also happens to be my son-in-law." I heard the soft scratching of a pen through the speaker. "Your own son-in-law." "Benjamin," echoed dark curiosity creeping into his voice. "What exactly did he do to warrant you coming out of retirement to destroy him?" "He just purchased a fraudulent medical diagnosis of severe cognitive impairment to force me into a locked conservatorship," I stated coldly. "He and my daughter are currently trying to strip away my human rights and seize my entire estate. And people do not orchestrate elaborate, highly illegal medical frauds just for the sheer thrill of it. They do not risk serious prison time unless there is a massive looming threat hanging over their own heads. Derek is hiding something catastrophic inside his real estate firm. They are moving with a reckless, terrifying speed. Follow the money. Ben, they are desperate. Find out why. I will need full authorization to bypass standard privacy protocols," Benjamin said, fully understanding the extreme gravity of the request. "Consider it granted." I replied, "I need you to dig into his hidden investors, his outstanding loans, and his private offshore holding accounts. I want to know who he owes, how much he owes, and exactly what kind of hostile leverage is forcing him to attack my life. I will have a preliminary dossier for you within 48 hours. Benjamin promised. We established a secure communication protocol, and I ended the call. I carefully removed the lithium battery from the burner phone and tucked the device deep inside my locked glove compartment. I sat there in the quiet dawn and stared out at the rising sun, the sky bleeding into a vibrant fiery orange. The trap was set. The bloodhounds of my past were officially released into the wild, and my treacherous daughter was about to painfully learn a truly devastating lesson about waking a sleeping predator who had absolutely nothing left to lose. 2 nights later, the damp midnight air chilled me to the bone. I parked my heavy truck at the edge of a completely abandoned logging road, several miles away from the watchful digital eyes I had carefully installed at my own farm. The dense canopy of ancient pine trees blocked out the moonlight, leaving me entirely swallowed by the pitch-black wilderness. I sat perfectly still in the driver's seat with the engine cut, listening to the rhythmic chirping of crickets. Exactly at the stroke of midnight, a bright pair of headlights swept rapidly across the dusty gravel path. A sleek, dark sedan rolled to a quiet stop mere inches from my heavy front bumper. The engine cut and the headlights died. A tall, broad-shouldered silhouette stepped out of the vehicle and walked deliberately toward my window. Benjamin Carter slipped into the passenger seat of my truck, bringing with him the distinct scent of stale coffee and cheap airport cologne. He did not offer a handshake. He simply opened a thick leather binder on his lap and illuminated it with a small, dim pen light. "You were absolutely right to trust your gut on this one. Harrison." Benjamin said, his voice a low, growly whisper. "Your son-in-law is not just swimming in debt. He is drowning in shark-infested waters." Benjamin handed me a stack of highly encrypted financial dossiers. I looked closely at the glaring red numbers bleeding across the detailed ledgers. "Derek Sterling is a complete fraud." Benjamin continued. "Sterling Development Group has been functionally bankrupt for over 18 months. He wildly overleveraged himself on 3 massive commercial development projects that completely failed their critical zoning inspections. The traditional banks cut his credit lines last year to keep up appearances and avoid a total public collapse. Derek turned to the shadow markets. He borrowed heavily from a syndicate of unregulated, highly violent private lenders based out of Chicago. These are not men who repossess your car when you miss a payment. These are men who repossess your kneecaps and threaten your family." I stared at the horrifying bottom line. Derek owed $15 million in principal, and the predatory interest was compounding daily. "He has missed his last 3 penalty payments," Benjamin explained grimly. "His handlers have officially lost their patience. They gave him a hard, non-negotiable deadline to produce the $15 million, or they are going to dismantle him piece by bloody piece." I absorbed the terrifying reality of Derek's situation. It perfectly explained his sudden vicious desperation, but it still did not explain why they were spending so much desperate time trying to legally steal my farm. I explicitly told him my land was just an old agricultural plot worth maybe $1 million on a good day. Benjamin shook his head slowly, reaching deeper into his leather binder. He pulled out a set of classified, highly restricted topographical maps stamped with the seal of the State Transportation Authority. "That is where you are wrong, Harrison," he said, tracing a red line across the map with his pen. "Your farm is no longer just dirt and trees. 2 weeks ago, the state government held a closed-door, unrecorded session. They secretly approved the final blueprints for a massive multi-billion-dollar interstate expansion project. The new logistics highway interchange is slated to run directly over your 50 acres. I looked closely at the stolen government schematics. My beautiful sanctuary, the sacred land Patty and I had promised to protect forever, was the exact epicenter of a massive commercial bottleneck. Because the state is desperate to break ground before the next election cycle, they are exercising eminent domain with extreme prejudice," Benjamin explained, tapping the final page of the dossier. "They have secretly allocated over $30 million to forcibly buy out your specific parcel of land. Your son-in-law caught wind of this classified approval through a corrupt contact at the zoning board." I leaned back against the headrest, letting the sheer horrifying magnitude of the betrayal wash over me. The puzzle was finally complete. The fake overdue bills, the stolen memories, the poisoned dog, and the fraudulent neurologist. It was never about my small savings. It was about controlling the $30 million payout. If Victoria successfully declared me legally incompetent and secured a strict conservatorship, she would instantly gain the absolute legal authority to sign the eminent domain paperwork on my behalf. She would force the sale of my sacred home, collect the $30 million from the state government, pay off her husband's violent mob debts, and easily pocket the rest. She is willingly trading your freedom, your sanity, and your legacy just to save her pathetic husband from the consequences of his own greed, Benjamin said softly, closing the heavy binder. She is selling you out to the mob. Harrison. I sat in the suffocating darkness of the truck cab, staring blankly at the dim pen light. My own daughter. She knew how much this land meant to her mother. She knew I wanted to die peacefully on this farm. Yet, she was actively planning to lock me inside a sterile, heavily medicated memory care ward. While bulldozers tore down Patty's rose garden, a cold, absolute void opened up inside my chest, swallowing the last remaining fragments of paternal love I held for Victoria. The biological tie between us severed completely in that silent truck. I quietly thanked Benjamin, promptly paying him his exorbitant fee in untraceable cash. I told him to remain on high standby. As he stepped out into the dark woods and vanished into the night, I felt a dangerous predatory calm settle deep into my bones. Victoria and Derek had confidently built their entire criminal survival strategy on the entirely false assumption that I was a weak, oblivious victim. They were about to painfully learn that they had driven a highly trained predator into a dark corner, and I was going to tear their entire world apart. I drove back to the farm under the cover of darkness. My mind was no longer clouded by the heavy grief of a betrayed father. It was operating with the cold, sterile efficiency of a federal investigator. When I walked through my front door, the profound silence of the house felt entirely different. It was no longer a lonely sanctuary. It was an active crime scene. I bypassed the master bedroom and walked directly into my locked private office. I closed the heavy oak door and drew the thick velvet curtains tightly shut. I turned on my secondary, heavily encrypted laptop. It was finally time to hunt. 6 months ago, shortly after my mild bout with the winter flu, Victoria had firmly insisted on setting up an overarching financial portal for all my accounts. She claimed she just wanted to happily help her aging father manage his tedious monthly bills. She had sat right in this very chair, typing away, smiling warmly, as she consolidated my entire life savings into a single, easily accessible digital dashboard. She had deliberately changed my primary banking passwords, effectively locking me out of my own financial infrastructure under the clever guise of loving daughterly protection. She genuinely thought she had effectively blinded me. What she completely failed to realize was that you cannot ever lock a master locksmith out of his own house. I did not attempt to formally reset the passwords. Doing so would immediately send an automated security alert directly to her phone, instantly tipping her off that the confused old man was actually awake and highly active. Instead, I quietly deployed a sophisticated tracking protocol I had successfully used 100 times during my lengthy tenure at the Department of Justice. I skillfully bypassed the standard login nodes and directly accessed the raw data packets, actively communicating with the local internet router she had previously installed in my living room. I woo my way through her incredibly rudimentary security firewalls with absolute ease. Within 45 minutes, I had successfully established a silent, invisible digital backdoor directly into the entire financial network she was currently managing from her luxury city penthouse. The antique grandfather clock in the long hallway chimed 2 in the morning. I drank a fresh cup of bitter black coffee, keeping my tired eyes firmly locked onto the glowing computer monitor. Rows of complex financial data rapidly cascaded across the bright screen. I systematically began to pull the highly guarded transactional ledgers, meticulously following the microscopic digital breadcrumbs she had so carelessly left behind. Victoria was certainly a smart, educated woman, but she was absolutely not a hardened professional criminal. She clearly lacked the deeply paranoid, obsessive discipline required to truly hide highly illicit money. She had foolishly left gaping digital holes in the hidden metadata. I immediately started noticing severe glaring anomalies in the recent banking routing transfers. Small, seemingly insignificant amounts of money were quietly bleeding out of my primary retirement accounts on a weekly basis. But they were definitely not paying for my local electricity or my county water bills. They were being secretly funneled into a highly convoluted, massive maze of phantom limited liability companies. I aggressively traced the state registration numbers of these obscure corporate entities. They were completely faceless shell companies, officially registered in distinct states with notoriously lax corporate transparency laws, places like Nevada, Delaware, and Wyoming. I dug much deeper, my stiff fingers flying rapidly across the illuminated keyboard. The coffee grew completely cold, but I absolutely did not stop. I relentlessly followed the complicated money trail from the domestic shell companies straight into the very murky depths of international offshore banking. I quickly found large wire transfers routed directly through secretive banking nodes in the Cayman Islands and the Republic of Cyprus. These protected accounts were rapidly moving hundreds of thousands of dollars in rapid, highly staggered succession. This was classic textbook financial layering. It was the exact, highly specific operational blueprint heavily used for laundering dirty money for violent cartels. But then I finally saw the horrifying detail that made my pumping blood run completely cold. I deeply pulled the specific Internet Protocol addresses and the digital authorization signatures permanently attached to these massive offshore wire transfers. They were absolutely not originating from Derek's failing commercial real estate firm. They were distinctly not coming from Victoria's expensive downtown penthouse. The digital footprints were systematically deliberately engineered to look exactly as though they were originating directly from my own private home network. The Heil authorization protocols were officially stamped with my precise legal name and my private personal social security number. I leaned heavily back in my worn leather chair, staring blankly at the horrifying reality illuminating the dark, quiet room. The $30 million state land sale was definitely their ultimate financial salvation, but the complex eminent domain process was incredibly slow. It would realistically take several long months for the state government to officially cut that massive public check. Derek's violent, unregulated creditors were absolutely not going to wait several months. They desperately needed substantial monetary payments right now today. Victoria and Derek were not just waiting patiently for the strict conservatorship to forcibly sell my beloved farm. They were actively utilizing my pristine identity, my incredibly clean criminal record, and my unblemished financial history to heavily launder the dangerous mob's money and successfully stall for precious time. If federal authorities or banking regulators detected this massive laundering operation, they would trace the illicit funds right back to this very desk. They would see a senile, incompetent old man who was moving millions of dollars for a violent criminal syndicate. I would be the perfect fall guy. I would die in a federal prison hospital, completely disgraced and stripped of my legacy. I saved the ledgers, downloading every single byte of damning evidence onto a secure encrypted flash drive. The sun was beginning to rise. My daughter had weaponized my identity to shield herself from monsters. My daughter had weaponized my identity to shield herself from monsters. But as the morning sun continued to rise, casting long beams of light across my wooden desk, I knew the digital breadcrumbs did not stop at international borders. The offshore accounts were merely the disposal mechanism. To move millions of dollars of illicit syndicate cash into the legitimate American banking system. Derek and Victoria needed a domestic washing machine. They needed a highly credible, completely unassailable front organization to receive the dirty funds before funneling them overseas. I rubbed my tired eyes and dove back into the encrypted server. I isolated the primary domestic routing numbers associated with the largest incoming deposits. The money was flowing through a designated tax-exempt nonprofit entity. I bypassed the state registry paywall and pulled the official incorporation documents. The digital file rendered slowly on my screen. I stared at the bold black text printed across the top of the federal form. My lungs completely stopped working. The ambient air in the quiet room suddenly felt incredibly heavy and suffocating. The registered name of the fake philanthropic organization was the Patricia Caldwell Memorial Fund. I traced my weathered fingers across the glass of the computer monitor, touching the digital letters of my late wife's name. A profound, suffocating wave of absolute disgust washed over my entire body, threatening to completely overwhelm my senses. Patty was a woman of uncompromising grace and boundless compassion. She had spent her entire adult life working as a dedicated advocate for the state foster care system. She poured her heart, her soul, and her personal savings into helping abandoned orphans find permanent loving homes. She built safe shelters for battered children. She fought tirelessly for the absolute most voiceless members of our broken society. Her name was entirely synonymous with selfless sacrifice and pure, unadulterated goodness. And now our own biological daughter was actively dragging that pristine, sacred legacy through the darkest, filthiest criminal mud imaginable. She had weaponized her own mother's angelic reputation. Victoria was aggressively exploiting the pristine memory of a literal saint to wash thick, heavy stacks of blood money for violently dangerous, merciless thugs. I pulled the foundational charter and the itemized transaction logs for the charity. The sheer operational cruelty of their financial architecture was staggering to behold. The fake fund was receiving massive anonymous donations from a vast interconnected web of untraceable benefactors. Once the dirty cash was safely deposited inside the protected tax-exempt umbrella, it was quickly dispersed as philanthropic grants. These grants were supposedly awarded to underprivileged community development initiatives across the impoverished sectors of the county. In reality, the money was being routed directly into Derek's failing commercial real estate ventures and those heavily obscured offshore accounts I had just uncovered. They were effectively utilizing the untouchable moral veneer of a dead woman's charity to rapidly clean millions of dollars in illicit mob revenue without triggering a single automated banking alert. And the most horrifying detail was printed at the very bottom of the primary registration form. I stared at my own forged signature, meticulously copied onto the final page. I was officially listed as the singular founding director, the sole financial signatory, and the absolute primary legal beneficiary. The physical mailing address for the entire illicit charity operation was my exact 50-acre farm in Lexington. The monstrous calculated scope of their profound betrayal was finally entirely clear. They were not merely waiting for me to be declared legally incompetent so they could aggressively sell the property. They were actively, painstakingly framing me for one of the most severe federal financial crimes in the modern penal code. If the Department of Justice or the Internal Revenue Service ever caught wind of this massive, highly coordinated laundering operation, their elite federal agents would not see a fragile, confused old man suffering from sudden onset dementia. They would see a highly sophisticated, deeply experienced retired forensic auditor who had completely broken bad. They would eagerly see a brilliant, ruthless criminal mastermind cynically using his dead wife's charitable foundation to seamlessly move dirty syndicate money across heavily monitored international borders. The ambitious federal prosecutors would violently rip my quiet life apart. I would be forcefully dragged out of my beautiful home in heavy iron handcuffs. I would be publicly stripped of my honorable pension, my lifelong dignity, and my hard-earned legacy. They would absolutely tear apart everything I had proudly built over my 35-year career in government service. I would spend the final incredibly fragile years of my life locked securely inside a cold, unforgiving federal penitentiary, universally remembered by the general public as a disgraced, utterly hypocritical monster. Victoria and Derek had carefully maliciously constructed the perfect, impenetrable scapegoat to bear the absolute ultimate weight of their unforgivable, deadly sins. They fully intended to let me rot away and die in a damp concrete cell while they quietly collected the massive $30 million eminent domain payout from the state government and walked away completely unscathed from the violent Chicago mob. I slowly closed the digital charity documents and safely transferred the highly encrypted evidence files onto my incredibly secure, untraceable external hard drive. The slight paternal sorrow I had felt just a few short hours earlier completely vanished into thin air, leaving nothing but a vast, icy emptiness behind in my battered soul. There was absolutely no room left for any hesitation or any shred of mercy in my heart. They had brazenly crossed the ultimate completely unforgivable threshold by violently violating Patty's sacred, beautiful memory. They had taken the only pure thing left in my entire existence and actively poisoned it with their boundless, sickening greed. I stood up from the heavy oak desk, my posture perfectly straight. My resolve suddenly hardened into unbreakable solid steel. I was no longer just fighting to protect my own physical freedom or the peaceful land I cherished. I was going to completely and utterly annihilate them. If Victoria and Derek were perfectly willing to frame me for a massive federal crime, what else were they truly capable of? I stood by my desk, the silence of the farm pressing in on me. The wooden floorboards creaked under my weight, a familiar sound that now felt entirely hollow. A chilling thought crept into my mind, spreading like ice through my veins. They had systematically isolated me from my friends and my former colleagues. They had seized complete control of my finances, manipulating my hard-earned wealth into a hidden criminal empire. They had orchestrated a fraudulent neurological exam to legally bind my mind and officially document me as a completely incompetent burden to society. But there was one final deeply vulnerable aspect of my life that I had blindly handed over to my daughter during a moment of profound weakness: my personal health care and all the deeply sensitive decisions it entailed. 6 months ago, when I suffered that severe bout of the winter flu, Victoria had insisted on managing my electronic medical records. She claimed she wanted to quickly schedule my telehealth appointments and ensure my daily prescriptions were refilled on time without any stressful delays. I had given her my primary login credentials, genuinely believing I was simply easing the burden of modern digital bureaucracy. Now, that innocent assumption felt like a fatal error. If she currently held the absolute keys to my physical autonomy, there was absolutely no telling what she had already set in motion behind my back. I sat back down in my worn leather chair, slowly cracking my stiff knuckles and preparing for a digital war. I quickly opened a fresh encrypted browser window and navigated directly to the regional healthcare provider's primary patient portal. When I attempted to log in using my original email address, a red error message immediately flashed across the bright screen. My password had been permanently altered, and the primary two-factor authentication phone number had been seamlessly swapped to Victoria's personal cell phone. She had successfully and completely locked me out of my own private biological data. I took a slow, deep breath, reining in the simmering anger that was steadily building in my chest. I was a senior forensic auditor. I had spent decades bypassing heavily fortified corporate firewalls and extracting hidden digital ledgers from some of the most secure private servers in the country. A standard civilian healthcare portal was absolutely not going to stop me from uncovering the truth. I quickly launched a specialized diagnostic program from my encrypted flash drive. I masked my local internet protocol address and sent a complex sequence of phantom access requests directly to the hospital server. This calculated maneuver effectively tricked the automated security system into blindly recognizing my computer as an authorized administrative terminal operating within their network. It took me less than 12 minutes to quietly bypass Victoria's crude digital locks and slip silently into my own comprehensive medical profile without triggering a single security alert on her end. The bright screen instantly loaded with a stark, crisp clinical efficiency. My photograph, my date of birth, and my basic medical history appeared in a neat, orderly grid. I navigated quickly through the standard medical menus, completely ignoring the routine blood panels, the basic cholesterol charts, and the mundane seasonal checkup notes. I was actively hunting for any unauthorized recent administrative changes. I clicked into the Detailed Account History tab, my eyes rapidly scanning the dense logs of recent digital activity. Over the past 3 weeks alone, Victoria had logged into this system no less than 14 times. She had certainly not been scheduling routine appointments or casually checking my daily vital signs. She had been aggressively downloading my entire historical medical chart, meticulously compiling every single minor ailment, every forgotten prescription, and every casually documented complaint of fatigue I had ever made to my primary care physician. She was systematically harvesting my personal health data to heavily reinforce the deeply fraudulent narrative of my rapid physical and cognitive decline. She was deliberately building a flawless, unassailable medical portfolio to present directly to the judge at the upcoming conservatorship hearing. She wanted to prove beyond any reasonable doubt that I was a failing old man who desperately needed to be institutionalized for his own safety. But as I scrolled further down the screen, my aging heart began to pound with a slow, heavy rhythm. Below the standard diagnostic charts and the routine prescription refill requests, there was a separate, highly secure digital folder designated exclusively for administrative legal uploads. I cautiously moved my computer cursor directly over the small folder icon. A cold bead of sweat slowly rolled down the back of my neck, tracing the line of my spine. I finally clicked the button and the screen instantly refreshed, revealing a short list of recently submitted digital documents. There were the expected entirely fraudulent power of attorney forms she had aggressively shoved in my face just yesterday morning, already uploaded and currently pending official clinical review by the hospital administration. But there was another document successfully submitted just 48 hours ago, long before the tragic, agonizing incident with my dog. It was a scanned multi-page digital file. I stared intensely at the stark black text of the document title, my breath catching painfully in my throat. It was boldly labeled in capital letters as Advance Directives. My hands began to tremble, not with the fake frailty of a broken old man, but with a deeply primal, entirely terrifying dread that chilled me to my absolute core. An advance directive was not a simple financial document used to manage bank accounts or real estate assets. It was a binding medical order that strictly dictated the exact legal terms of my physical survival in the event of a catastrophic health crisis. I hovered my digital arrow over the uploaded file, the agonizing tension tightening my chest into a painful knot, and slowly clicked the document open. The digital document loaded slowly across my bright screen, rendering page by page with a cold clinical precision. The very first sheet was a formal medical proxy agreement. It granted Victoria absolute unilateral authority over every single aspect of my physical health and my medical care. According to this highly official form, if I were ever incapacitated or deemed unfit to make my own decisions, she alone would hold the ultimate power to dictate my treatments, my surgical procedures, and my daily medication. But the true horror was waiting patiently at the bottom of the page. There, resting on the final signature line, was a flawless forgery of my own handwriting. It was not a clumsy, rushed imitation. It was a perfectly executed copy of the distinct sharp loops and heavy cursive strokes I had used for decades to sign highly classified federal documents. She had likely traced it from one of my old checks or a birthday card. The sheer calculation required to commit this level of intimate fraud was staggering. Yet, the medical proxy was merely the precursor to something far more sinister and deadly. I scrolled down to the second page of the uploaded digital file. The bold black letters at the top of the form seemed to leap off the screen and wrap their icy fingers tightly around my throat. Do not resuscitate. It was a legally binding, fully notarized state medical order. I read through the dense, chilling paragraphs of strict clinical language. The document explicitly instructed any attending physicians, emergency medical technicians, and hospital staff to completely withhold all life-saving interventions. If my breathing stopped, they were legally barred from performing cardiopulmonary resuscitation. If my heart suddenly failed, they were strictly forbidden from using a defibrillator or administering any emergency cardiac medications. If I choked or lost consciousness, no breathing tube would ever be inserted. The medical professionals would be legally mandated to simply step back, cross their arms, and watch me quietly expire. And right next to another flawless forgery of my signature was a deeply cynical checkbox filled in with thick black ink. It indicated that this decision was made after profound, careful consultation with my designated medical proxy. My daughter had officially legally authorized my death. The terrifying reality of their ultimate endgame crashed over me like a freezing tidal wave. They were not merely planning to lock me away inside a high-end assisted living facility to safely force the sale of my farm. A lengthy conservatorship could potentially be contested. A messy legal battle could easily drag on for months or even years, draining their highly limited resources and dangerously testing the fragile patience of the violent Chicago mob. Derek owed those ruthless men $15 million right now. They desperately needed the $30 million state infrastructure payout immediately. A living, breathing father fighting them in a civil courtroom was a massive liability. But a dead father was a perfectly clean, remarkably swift resolution to all of their towering problems. If I suddenly suffered a mild, highly survivable heart attack, the paramedics would be legally forced to let me die on my own living room floor. If Victoria came over for a friendly Sunday visit and decided to quietly slip an untraceable chemical into my morning tea, exactly like her husband had done to my innocent dog, I would quickly lose consciousness. The emergency room doctors would access my medical portal, see the binding state directive, and turn off the life support machines without asking a single question. I was a dead man walking in my own home. I sat perfectly still in the dim glow of my computer monitor. I did not shed a single tear. I did not scream or slam my fists against the heavy oak desk. The deep, agonizing grief of a betrayed father, the profound sorrow that had weighed heavily on my tired shoulders for the past few days, completely and utterly evaporated. It was instantly replaced by a pure, absolute ice that froze my soul and chilled my blood. My own daughter had coldly calculated the exact monetary value of my remaining years and decided my life was worth trading for her husband's survival. She had cynically looked at the man who had raised her, protected her, and loved her unconditionally, and she had meticulously forged my execution papers. The emotional bond that had once connected us was permanently severed, cauterized by the sheer magnitude of her unforgivable malice. I was no longer dealing with a misguided child or a greedy heir. I was dealing with a ruthless, predatory adversary who posed a direct lethal threat to my physical survival. I slowly saved the forged medical documents onto my encrypted external hard drive, adding them to the growing mountain of damning federal evidence. I securely logged out of the hospital portal, completely covering my digital tracks, and quietly shut the laptop down. The room plunged back into profound darkness, but my mind was brilliantly illuminated with absolute terrifying clarity. The final phase of my strategy was now firmly in place. I was going to patiently let the heavy steel jaws of their trap snap shut, only to brutally remind them that they had unknowingly locked themselves inside the cage with an apex predator. I was going to destroy their entire world with a smile on my face. The paperwork was ready. The traps were fully armed. They believed they were hunting a vulnerable old man, but they had absolutely no idea what kind of monster they had just woken up. My daughter wanted me dead, but I was going to make sure she spent the rest of her pathetic life trapped behind cold iron bars. The battle lines were drawn. The evidence was secured. The absolute time for vengeance had officially arrived right now. Tomorrow they would come to pack my bags, and I would gladly let them. I would play my final performance flawlessly, preparing to unleash hell upon them. The morning sun cast a pale, watery light across the weathered floorboards of my living room. I sat in my armchair, wrapped in a thick woolen cardigan that Patty had knitted for me over a decade ago. I stared blankly at the cold fireplace, practicing the hollow, vacant expression I would need for the performance ahead. I let my shoulders droop, curving my spine to mimic the physical weight of advancing age and mental decay. I focused on slowing my breathing, adopting a shallow, fragile rhythm. At exactly 9 o'clock, the heavy crunch of tires on gravel announced their arrival. Victoria and Derek did not bother to knock. They pushed the front door open, bustling inside with a flurry of loud, intrusive energy. Derek carried a stack of flattened cardboard boxes under one arm and a roll of heavy packing tape in his other hand. Victoria trailed behind him, holding a sleek tablet and a large steaming cup of expensive coffee. They looked like a young, ambitious couple preparing to flip a neglected property, completely devoid of any solemnity or respect for the life I had built within these walls. "Morning, Dad." Victoria sang out, her voice unnaturally bright and cheerful. "We brought the boxes. We need to get a head start on packing your essentials. Tomorrow is a very big day." She did not ask how I was feeling. She did not ask if I had slept. She simply marched into the kitchen and began opening cabinets, the sharp clatter of dishes echoing through the quiet house. I slowly pushed myself up from the armchair, deliberately leaning heavily on my wooden cane. I shuffled my feet across the rug, taking small, hesitant steps toward the kitchen. "What are we packing for?" I asked, letting my voice crack slightly, painting a picture of profound confusion. Victoria sighed, a short, performative exhalation designed to convey immense patience. "We talked about this." "Dad," she said, not even turning around to look at me. "The hearing is tomorrow morning. We already have a beautiful room secured for you at Oak Creek. It has a lovely view of the gardens. You are going to be so much safer there. We just need to pack your clothes, your toiletries, and maybe a few small photographs. They do not allow a lot of personal furniture." Derek dropped the cardboard boxes onto the dining table with a loud, dismissive thud. He began ripping off long strips of packing tape, the harsh tearing sound grating against my nerves. "Yeah, Harrison," he muttered finally, looking at me with a smirk that made my skin crawl. "Time to downsize. You do not need all this junk anyway. It is just collecting dust." He picked up a framed photograph of Patty from the side table, glanced at it for a fleeting second, and casually tossed it into an empty box. The glass cracked against the cardboard bottom. He did not apologize. He did not even flinch. It was a deliberate act of profound disrespect, a blatant display of dominance over a man he firmly believed was entirely broken and powerless. I stared at the cracked frame, the agonizing urge to cross the room and wrap my hands around his throat, flaring violently in my chest. But I ruthlessly suppressed it. I forced my eyes to widen and fabricated distress. I reached out a trembling hand toward the box. "My picture," I mumbled, playing the pathetic victim flawlessly. "Please be careful with Patty." Derrick rolled his eyes and turned away, completely ignoring my plea. He walked toward my private office, the room where I had uncovered the massive depths of their federal crimes just hours before. "Let us start in here," he announced to Victoria. "There is a ton of old paperwork we need to shred before the real estate agents come through next week to stage the house." He reached for the heavy oak door. My heart hammered a steady warning rhythm. I knew my encrypted hard drive and the hidden surveillance router were securely locked away in a hidden compartment behind a false bookshelf. But watching him invade that space tested every ounce of my disciplined restraint. I shuffled quickly behind him, trying to sound desperately anxious. "Do not touch my papers," I protested weakly. "Those are important. They are my files." Derrick paused in the doorway, turning his head to look down at me. His smug smirk widened into a sneer of absolute contempt. He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a harsh, mocking whisper. "They are garbage, old man," he sneered. "Just like this whole rotting house. You do not need files anymore. You need a nurse to remind you to put your pants on. Go sit down and let the adults handle this." The sheer staggering arrogance of his words echoed in the hallway. He truly believed I was an empty shell, a mindless obstacle he could simply brush aside with a casual insult. He believed he was the apex predator in this room. He had absolutely no idea that he was currently standing on a highly sensitive landmine, and I was holding the remote detonator. I lowered my head, letting my chin rest against my chest. I nodded slowly, as if thoroughly defeated by his cruel dominance. I turned around and shuffled slowly back toward the living room, feeling his dismissive gaze burning into my back. As I retreated, I heard him laugh softly, a dry, arrogant chuckle shared with Victoria. "He thinks he still works for the government," Derrick muttered loudly enough for me to hear. "It is honestly pathetic." Victoria shushed him, but she was laughing, too. I sank back into my armchair, pulling the woolen cardigan tighter around my shoulders. I closed my eyes, listening to the agonizing sounds of them carelessly tearing apart my home, boxing up my memories, and preparing me for a clinical execution. They were joyfully packing my life into cheap cardboard, wholly convinced that tomorrow would bring them absolute, unassailable victory. They were so blinded by their own greed and their desperate need to satisfy their violent creditors that they failed to notice the profound, terrifying stillness radiating from the old man in the corner. I sat perfectly motionless, conserving my energy playing the broken man to absolute perfection. Tomorrow, they would eagerly walk into a courtroom, expecting a swift, simple surrender. Tomorrow, I would gladly show them exactly what a lifetime of federal prosecution truly looked like. The final act was ready to begin. By late afternoon, the house was a barren landscape of sealed cardboard boxes and bare shelves. I emerged from the living room, my gait slow and shuffling, and found Victoria and Derrick washing their hands at the kitchen sink. I leaned heavily against the wooden doorframe, letting a deep, sorrowful sigh escape my lips. I asked them if we could share one last family dinner right here at the farm, just the three of us before my hearing tomorrow. I told them I wanted to remember the good times before moving into the assisted living facility. They exchanged an annoyed glance, but Victoria quickly smoothed her features into a mask of pity. She agreed, likely thinking that humoring a defeated old man would make her look like the perfect caring daughter. I retreated to my bathroom to wash up, behind the locked door. I unbuttoned my heavy cardigan and carefully taped a high-fidelity military raw audio transmitter flat against my sternum. I secured the tiny microphone just beneath the collar of my undershirt. It was fully charged and actively broadcasting to my secure offshore server. Every single breath, every whisper, and every arrogant confession was about to be immortalized in pristine digital audio. I cooked 2 thick ribeye steaks for them, burning my own slightly to play into the false narrative that I was losing my basic motor skills. We sat around the heavy oak dining table. This was the very same table where Patty and I had celebrated Victoria's high school graduation, where we had carved turkeys on Thanksgiving, and where we had built a lifetime of genuine family memories. Now it felt exactly like a hostile interrogation room. Derek cut into his meat with aggressive sawing motions, washing it down with a glass of my most expensive vintage red wine. He did not even bother to ask if I wanted a pour. Victoria pushed her food around her porcelain plate, staring at me with a sickeningly sweet expression that made my stomach churn with absolute disgust. Dad, Victoria began, her voice quivering with perfectly orchestrated emotion. She reached across the polished table and placed her soft hand directly over my callous one. I want you to know how incredibly hard this is for us. Her eyes welled up with large theatrical tears that rolled delicately down her powdered cheeks. This is breaking my heart, Dad, but it is because I love you so much. We are only doing this because we want you to be safe. You have to believe that we are acting in your absolute best interest. I looked down at her manicured hand resting on mine. I did not pull away. I let my own hand tremble slightly, playing the grateful, confused father to utter perfection. I know, sweetheart, I whispered, keeping my tone fragile and incredibly soft. I know you are just trying to help your old man. My mind, however, was a steel trap. The hidden audio bug resting securely on my chest was actively capturing every single syllable of her disgusting, manipulative performance. I took a slow bite of my overcooked steak, chewing deliberately before looking back up at Derek. I just worry about the costs, I said, letting a note of profound anxiety creep into my shaking voice. That facility you showed me in the brochure looked so impossibly expensive. How am I going to pay for it? I cannot even remember where my checkbook is anymore. Derek let out a short, arrogant bark of a laugh. He leaned back in his heavy wooden chair, swirling the dark red wine in his crystal glass. You do not need to worry about a checkbook. Harrison, he said dismissively, Victoria and I have already taken full control of your primary accounts. We consolidated your entire retirement portfolio a few months ago, remember? Victoria nodded eagerly, tightening her cold grip on my hand. Yes, Dad, she added smoothly. We have all your passwords and routing numbers secured on our private network. We are managing all your digital transfers and corporate holdings. You do not have to lift a single finger. We have complete access to everything you own, so the facility is completely covered. I let out a heavy sigh of relief, as if a massive burden had been lifted from my frail shoulders. Thank goodness, I muttered. I was so terrified I would accidentally send my savings to the wrong place. I am glad you are running the accounts now. I took a sip of water, letting the heavy silence stretch for a moment before casually dropping the next piece of dangerous bait. But what about my health? I asked, my eyes darting nervously between the two of them. My chest has been feeling a little tight lately. If my heart gives out, or if I end up in the hospital, who is going to tell the doctors what to do? I cannot remember the names of my pills. Victoria offered a reassuring maternal smile, her trap snapping shut exactly as I had planned. Do not stress yourself. Dad, I am your official medical proxy now. I submitted the advance directives to the regional hospital portal myself just 2 days ago. I am the only one legally authorized to make your medical decisions, even in an absolute emergency. The doctors have to listen to me. Whatever happens, your treatment is entirely in my hands." Derek grinned around a mouthful of steak, adding his own nail to their coffin. "You are totally covered, old man. We hold all the legal cards. You just sit back and let us steer the ship." I smiled back at the two of them. The rest of the long dinner passed. They eagerly finished the wine and left the dishes soaking in the sink, rushing out the front door with promises to pick me up early the next morning for the courthouse. I reached quietly beneath my collar and carefully deactivated the audio transmitter. The digital recording was absolutely and entirely flawless. The digital recording was flawless. I sat alone in the silence of my dining room for a long time after they left. The smell of roasted meat and spilled wine hung in the air. I did not clear the dirty plates or wipe the stained wood. I simply remained in my chair, staring into the darkness that had enveloped my home. The grandfather clock down the hallway ticked with a relentless rhythm, counting away the final, fragile hours of my old life. When the deep chimes struck 2 in the morning, headlights cut through the dense canopy of trees lining the dirt road of my property. The vehicle coasted into the rear driveway with its engine cut. Moments later, 3 sharp knocks tapped against the glass of my back door. I stood up, feeling the stiffness in my aged joints, and walked slowly through the pitch-black kitchen. I turned the deadbolt and pulled the door open, letting the freezing night air rush inside. Benjamin Carter stepped over the threshold like a shadow. He was dressed entirely in dark charcoal, his face drawn and exceptionally grim. In his right hand, he carried a massive heavy black leather briefcase. It looked like a weapon of mass destruction encased in polished hide. He walked straight into the dining room, ignoring the scattered remnants of my family dinner, and set the heavy briefcase directly onto the center of the oak table. He did not say a word as he popped the twin brass latches. The sharp metallic clicks echoed like a firing squad loading their rifles. Benjamin flipped the heavy leather lid open, revealing the absolute culmination of my invisible war. Inside the meticulously organized compartments were over 500 pages of pristine, irrefutable, court-admissible evidence. It was a perfectly constructed lethal legal arsenal gathered and verified by one of the most ruthless investigators in the country. I reached out and gently touched the top of the crisp white stacks. The physical weight of the documents represented the complete and utter annihilation of my daughter and her husband. Benjamin began to unpack the contents, laying them out across the wood like a tactical map. First was a thick sealed envelope bearing the official crest of Dr. Henry Wallace. It contained the certified, legally sworn toxicology report explicitly detailing the calculated dose of deadly anti-rees that Derek had maliciously fed to my loyal dog. Beside it, Benjamin placed a series of high-resolution color printed still frames extracted directly from my hidden driveway camera. They perfectly captured the exact undeniable moment Derek handed a thick, bulging envelope of illicit cash to the disgraced, fraudulent neurologist, the license plate, the faces, the exchange of currency. Everything was captured with terrifying clarity. Next came the financial records. Benjamin hauled out a thick binder filled with legally subpoenaed wire transfer logs. These documents meticulously mapped the dark, convoluted journey of $15 million of violent mob money. They definitively proved the illicit funds flowing directly through the deeply offensive fake charity bearing my late wife's sacred name, completely bypassing my forged signature and landing securely in offshore accounts managed by Derek. Finally, Benjamin placed a stark white federal subpoena right in the center of the table. He had leveraged his deepest contacts within the Department of Justice to ensure federal marshals were fully briefed and actively waiting on standby for the moment. This explosive evidence was introduced into the public record. I stared down at the sprawling landscape of undeniable guilt. Every single lie, every hidden transaction, every act of cruel abuse was now reduced to cold, hard facts printed on bright white paper. There was absolutely no room for debate. There was no margin for any legal maneuvering. It was a perfect, inescapable trap. Benjamin stepped back from the table, crossing his strong arms over his broad chest. He watched me intensely, his dark eyes searching my weathered face for any sudden signs of hesitation or lingering paternal weakness. He had worked with me long enough to know the devastating toll that bringing a federal hammer down on someone truly took. He also knew that this was not a faceless corporate executive or a distant mafia boss. "This was my own blood," Harrison Benjamin said, his voice dropping to a low, deeply serious whisper that commanded the quiet room. "I have built a lot of catastrophic cases in my career. I have ruined a lot of powerful people. But this is different. Once you carry this briefcase into that courtroom tomorrow morning, there is absolutely no turning back. You will trigger a massive federal cascade. They will be arrested on the spot. They will be publicly ruined bankrupt, and they will spend decades in a maximum security penitentiary." He paused, letting the gravity of his words sink into the stagnant air. He looked directly into my eyes, forcing me to confront the absolute magnitude of my impending actions. "Are you sure you want to destroy your own daughter?" The question hung in the freezing night air, echoing softly against the wooden walls of my empty home. I looked away from Benjamin and stared down at the cracked picture frame resting at the bottom of the nearest packing box. Derek had tossed Patty's smiling photograph in there just hours earlier, treating her memory like worthless garbage. I thought about my innocent dog suffering on the hard gravel. I thought about the forged legal documents authorizing my sudden, unresisted death. I thought about the greedy strangers sitting at my dining table, eagerly drinking my wine while planning to lock me inside a sterile, terrifying cage for the rest of my days. The last fading ember of a father's unconditional love was permanently, violently extinguished inside my chest. I looked back up at Benjamin, my expression completely void of any sorrow, any regret, or any mercy. "I lost my daughter years ago," I replied, my voice steady and entirely devoid of emotion. "Tomorrow, I am just taking out a parasite." The dawn arrived with a cold, piercing light that spilled through the gaps in the velvet curtains. I stood up from the dining room chair, leaving the heavy black leather briefcase resting securely on the oak table. The physical exhaustion that had plagued me for the past 3 weeks simply evaporated. The performance was officially over. In the privacy of my quiet home, I completely dropped the fragile, trembling facade I had meticulously maintained. I stopped rounding my shoulders. I stopped curving my spine. I took a deep, commanding breath and stood up to my full natural height of 6 feet and 2 inches. My old joints popped and protested slightly against the sudden shift in posture, but my muscles quickly remembered their former strength. I walked down the long hallway toward the master bedroom. My footsteps, no longer a hesitant, shuffling scrape against the floorboards, but a steady, heavy, and deliberate march. The man who had cowed in the armchair yesterday was gone, replaced by the ghost of a prosecutor who had once struck pure terror into the hearts of the most ruthless and powerful men in the entire state. I entered my bedroom and looked at the neatly stacked moving boxes piled in the corner. Resting perfectly on top of my unmade bed were the clothes Victoria had deliberately laid out for me to wear to the courthouse this morning. It was a pathetic, highly calculated ensemble: a faded, oversized beige cardigan, a pair of shapeless gray trousers with an elastic waistband, and worn-out, scuffed walking shoes with Velcro straps. She wanted me to walk into the family courtroom looking like a discarded relic, a thoroughly confused and helpless burden who desperately needed the merciful intervention of the state. She had carefully designed this humiliating costume to visually reinforce her fabricated medical narrative for the judge. I stared down at the pathetic pile of fabric. A cold, humorless smile touched the corners of my mouth. I picked up the beige sweater, feeling the cheap, worn threads against my callous fingertips, and tossed it carelessly into the nearest cardboard box. I was absolutely not going into that courtroom as her helpless victim. I was going in as her executioner. I turned my back on the packed boxes and walked purposefully toward the deep cedar closet at the far end of the room. I reached past the casual flannel shirts, the denim jackets, and the heavy winter coats I had worn during my quiet retirement years. Deep in the very back, hidden behind a row of forgotten garments, hung a thick black canvas garment bag. I pulled it out into the morning light, feeling the familiar comforting weight of the fabric. I unzipped the heavy brass closure, the sharp sound slicing through the quiet room. Inside, protected from the dust, and the passage of time hung my armor. It was a bespoke razor-sharp charcoal gray suit, tailored from the finest Italian wool. This was not just a piece of clothing. It was a tangible, potent symbol of absolute authority. This was the exact suit I had worn when I stood before federal juries and methodically dismantled the largest, most violent organized crime syndicates in the country. It was the suit I wore when I looked corrupt politicians and ruthless mob bosses directly in the eyes and sent them away to maximum security prisons for the rest of their natural lives. I carried the suit into the master bathroom and turned on the harsh overhead lights. I showered quickly, washing away the lingering scent of weakness and manufactured decay. I shaved with a sharp, straight razor, clearing away the scruff I had intentionally allowed to grow over the past few days. I combed my silver hair back perfectly, securing every strand in place with a disciplined, immaculate precision. Then I began the deliberate process of getting dressed. I put on a crisp, heavily starched white dress shirt, buttoning it all the way to the collar. I tied a dark crimson silk tie, pulling the knot tight against my throat. I slipped my legs into the perfectly tailored charcoal trousers, feeling the sharp, clean crease of the wool. I polished my black leather Oxford shoes until they gleamed brightly under the artificial light. Finally, I shrugged my broad shoulders into the heavy charcoal jacket. The garment fit me perfectly, instantly, transforming my entire silhouette. The broad shoulders and the tapered waist radiated a formidable, commanding presence that completely obliterated any lingering trace of a frail, dying old man. I stepped back and looked deeply into the large vanity mirror. The transformation was absolute. I did not see a retired, grieving widower. I did not see a confused, helpless father waiting to be locked away in a memory care ward. I saw the relentless, unforgiving force of the federal justice system. The cold, unyielding eyes staring back at me were the eyes of a seasoned apex predator who had successfully hunted monsters for 35 years. The heavy charcoal fabric clung to my frame like dark armor forged in the fires of righteous vengeance. I looked exactly like death incarnate, perfectly dressed and patiently waiting to collect a massive overdue debt. I walked back into the dining room and picked up the heavy black leather briefcase containing the 500 pages of irrefutable catastrophic evidence. I gripped the sturdy brass handle, feeling the immense lethal power secured inside the polished hide. I stood perfectly still in the center of the silent house. Then the loud crunch of heavy tires rolling over the gravel driveway broke the morning calm. They honestly thought they had broken my spirit. They thought I was surrendering to their vile manipulation, but they were walking blindly into a devastating trap that I had meticulously laid. Victoria and Derek had arrived to collect their easy prey. I turned toward the front door, ready to face them entirely and finally burn their corrupt and wicked world to the ground. When I opened the front door, Victoria and Derek were on the porch, their impatient expressions freezing into masks of absolute shock. Victoria expected a crumbling, defeated old man, shuffling out in the pathetic, oversized cardigan she selected for my public humiliation. Instead, she found herself staring up at a towering figure draped in razor-sharp charcoal wool. For a fleeting second, a flicker of genuine uncertainty crossed her perfectly powdered face. She blinked, unable to reconcile the fierce, imposing man standing before her with the helpless victim she thought she created. Her arrogance quickly rushed back to fill the void. She let out a mocking laugh as if my bespoke suit was a tragic attempt to cling to the past. "Oh, Dad," she sighed, her voice dripping with fake patronizing sweetness. "You got all dressed up for your big day. How incredibly sweet." Derek did not even bother looking at me. He was busy texting on his phone, furiously coordinating details of the $30 million land sale he believed was hours away. He simply scoffed, turned his back, and marched toward their luxury vehicle. I followed them in my truck, keeping a steady distance as we navigated the winding roads toward the city center. The heavy black leather briefcase rested securely on the passenger seat beside me. The imposing limestone pillars of the county courthouse loomed ahead, casting dark shadows across the steps. As I stepped through the oak doors of the family courtroom, the air instantly froze, bringing us full circle to the moment this nightmare began. The room was grand, lined with rich, dark wood, and filled with the suffocating silence of legal proceedings. I walked down the center aisle, my polished leather shoes clicking sharply against the marble floor. Victoria leaned back in her plush leather chair and let out another mocking laugh that echoed off the high ceiling. Beside her, Derek turned his head, staring down at the polished floor, refusing to meet my eyes. They sat there, radiating unearned confidence. They thought they had won the war before the first shot was fired. They thought the man taking his seat was completely at their mercy, ready to be stripped of his fundamental human rights. The heavy wooden door behind the elevated bench swung open, and the bailiff instructed the courtroom to rise. Judge Richard Montgomery strode into the room, his black robes billowing behind him. He was a man projecting an aura of strict, no-nonsense judicial authority. He took his seat, adjusted his reading glasses, and opened the thick folder resting on his mahogany desk. He picked up his wooden pen and began to read the morning docket aloud, his voice echoing through the sound system. Case number 4092. He announced his tone routine and detached. Petition for the establishment of a permanent medical and financial conservatorship. The petitioner is Victoria Caldwell Sterling. The respondent is Harrison Caldwell. He paused, turning the page of the filing. As he spoke my name, he glanced up from his paperwork to survey the courtroom. His gaze swept past Victoria and Derek, ignoring their eager, expectant faces. Then his eyes landed squarely on me. I sat perfectly straight, my hands resting calmly on top of the black leather briefcase. I locked my gaze directly onto his. In that exact fraction of a second, the air was sucked out of the room, all the color violently drained from the judge's face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. His jaw went slack. The wooden pen slipped from his trembling fingers, hitting the desk with a loud, sharp clatter that sounded like a gunshot in the dead. Silent room. His hands were shaking as he gripped the edge of the bench, leaning forward as if trying to comprehend an absolute impossibility. "My God," he whispered the microphone, catching the raw shock in his voice. "Is that really him?" Every single eye in the courtroom shifted instantly toward me. Victoria's arrogant smirk vanished, replaced by a sudden creeping dread. She did not understand what was happening, But Richard Montgomery understood. 25 years ago, Montgomery was not a respected judge. He was a terrified young legal intern working in the federal prosecutor's office. He had been meticulously framed by a corrupt syndicate of senior attorneys who were taking massive bribes from an organized crime family. They planted illicit cash in his bank accounts and forged his signature on compromised legal documents, setting him up to take the fall for their corruption. He was looking at 20 years in a federal prison. His career and future were completely over until I stepped in. I was the senior forensic auditor assigned to review the case files. I did not just glance at the summaries. I ruthlessly tore the fabricated evidence apart line by line. I tracked the digital metadata, exposed the forged signatures, and dismantled the entire corrupt conspiracy, sending the senior attorneys to prison and saving that intern's life. I taught him what true justice looked like, and I showed him the terrifying power of an uncompromising legal mind. Now looking down from his bench, Judge Montgomery was not seeing a frail, dementia-riddled old man who needed to be locked away in an assisted living facility. He was staring at the legendary ghost of the Department of Justice. He knew exactly what kind of calculating apex predator was sitting quietly in his courtroom. He knew the immaculate charcoal suit I wore was not a costume, but the dark armor of a man preparing for absolute war. As he looked from my cold eyes to the smug faces of my daughter and son-in-law, a profound realization washed over the judge's terrified features. He understood that Victoria and Derek had not brought a helpless victim into his court. They had unknowingly dragged a highly explosive federal bomb directly into the center of the room, and I was sitting there holding my finger firmly on the detonator. The suffocating silence in the courtroom was finally broken by the sound of a chair scraping against the polished marble floor. Victoria's attorney stood up, straightening his expensive, custom-tailored navy blue suit. He was a slick, highly polished man in his early 40s, projecting the kind of unearned arrogance that only comes from winning easy cases against defenseless people. He approached the center podium with a confident theatrical stride, completely oblivious to the sheer terror radiating from the judge sitting high above him. He adjusted his silk tie, cleared his throat, and launched directly into a heavily rehearsed, deeply condescending monologue. "Your Honor," the lawyer began, his voice echoing with a manufactured, sorrowful tone, "we are gathered here today to address a deeply unfortunate and profoundly tragic situation. Before you sits Harrison Caldwell, a man who once led a productive life, but who is now suffering from a severe, rapid, and heartbreaking mental decline. The petitioner, his devoted daughter, has spent the last several months watching her beloved father lose his grip on reality. He wanders his rural property in a state of constant confusion. He loses his keys, misplaces his mail, and suffers from alarming memory lapses. Just a few days ago, in a terrifying display of his severe cognitive decay, he mistakenly fed his own loyal dog a lethal dose of human blood pressure medication. He is an immediate, undeniable danger to himself and to the community. We are asking this court to grant a permanent medical and financial conservatorship so his loving family can finally place him in a secure 24-hour memory care facility where he can no longer cause any harm." The lawyer paused, expecting a sympathetic nod from the bench. Instead, Judge Richard Montgomery was gripping his wooden gavel so tightly his knuckles were completely white. Beads of cold sweat had formed along the judge's hairline. He was not looking at the arrogant lawyer. His terrified, unwavering gaze was locked entirely on me. He knew with absolute certainty that every single word leaving that attorney's mouth was a catastrophic, career-ending mistake. "Counselor, that is quite enough." Judge Montgomery interrupted his voice, shaking noticeably through the courtroom microphone. The lawyer blinked, his confident smile faltering at the sharp, highly unusual reprimand. He stepped back from the podium, clearly confused by the hostile reception. Judge Montgomery swallowed hard, visibly trying to compose himself, and addressed me directly. "Mr. Caldwell." The judge said, his tone incredibly respectful, bordering on reverent. "The court notes that you do not have legal representation present today. Do you have counsel, or would you like this court to appoint a public defender on your behalf?" I placed my hands flat on the table and stood up. I did not lean on the table for support. I stood at my full, imposing height, pushing my broad shoulders back, allowing the tailored charcoal suit to radiate absolute authority. I looked directly at the trembling judge, my voice booming across the vast room with the terrifying, commanding resonance of a veteran federal prosecutor. "Your Honor," I announced, every syllable dripping with icy precision, "I am representing myself today." A collective gasp rippled through the small gallery. Victoria snapped her head toward me, her eyes widening in profound confusion. The fragile, shuffling old man she had brought to the courthouse had vanished entirely. Derek finally stopped texting on his cellular phone, his jaw dropping open as he stared at me. Victoria's lawyer scoffed loudly, attempting to quickly regain control of the narrative. "Your Honor," the lawyer protested, waving his hand dismissively in my direction. "This is highly irregular and frankly absurd. The respondent is clearly suffering from severe delusions. Allowing a man in his diminished mental state to represent himself is a complete mockery of this court. Sit down and remain entirely silent." "Counselor," Judge Montgomery barked, and slamming his gavel down with a violent crack that made the lawyer physically jump. "You will speak only when spoken to. Mr. Caldwell, you have the floor. Please proceed." I reached down and unlocked the heavy brass latches of my black leather briefcase. The sharp metallic clicks echoed like a firing squad, readying their weapons. I opened the lid and calmly extracted a stack of thick, sealed white envelopes. I walked with slow, measured steps toward the judge's bench, handing the first envelope directly to the bailiff to pass up to the judge. I turned and handed a second copy directly to Victoria's stunned attorney. "What you are holding," I stated, my voice echoing with lethal calm, "is a certified, legally sworn toxicology report from Dr. Henry Wallace, one of the most respected veterinary specialists in this state. It conclusively proves that my dog did not ingest human blood pressure medication. He was deliberately poisoned with a highly calculated near-lethal dose of ethylene glycol, commonly known as anti-Rees." I turned my head slowly, locking my cold, unyielding eyes directly onto my son-in-law. Derek's face instantly lost all of its color, turning a sickly pale shade of gray. He shrank back into his leather chair, physically retreating from my gaze. Victoria's lawyer frantically scanned the certified medical document, his arrogant confidence rapidly evaporating into thin air, but I was not even close to finished. I walked back to my table and pulled a sleek, high-definition digital tablet from the depths of the black briefcase. I tapped the screen to wake the device, set the volume to maximum, and placed it directly on the petitioner's table, right in front of the sweating lawyer and my trembling daughter. I pressed play. The crisp, green-tinted security footage illuminated their faces. The audio was crystal clear. It showed Derek casually handing a thick manila envelope stuffed with illicit cash directly to Dr. Miller. The lawyer stared at the digital screen in sheer horror. Realizing his catastrophic exposure to a massive federal conspiracy, he turned completely pale and physically stepped far away from Victoria. He was trapped. The digital tablet looped the incriminating footage over and over again, the harsh sound of Derek's bribe echoing loudly across the stunned courtroom. Victoria stared at the screen, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly like a fish pulled from the water. She turned desperately toward her attorney, expecting him to launch a fiery legal defense to object to the evidence or to somehow save her from the rapidly collapsing reality. But the slick lawyer simply held up his hands, shaking his head rapidly, physically distancing himself from his own clients. He knew that participating in any further deception would instantly result in his own disbarment and likely federal indictment. I did not give them a single moment to recover. I turned my back on their panic and returned to my open briefcase. The atmosphere in the room had shifted entirely from a tragic family dispute into a high-stakes federal tribunal. I pulled out a heavy 3-inch thick binder secured with a heavy black clasp. I handed it directly to the bailiff, who carried it up to the sweating judge with a renewed sense of urgency. "Your Honor," I stated, my voice slicing through the heavy silence with lethal precision. "The document before you outlines a massive, highly sophisticated money laundering operation. It meticulously details the illicit transfer of over $15 million originating from known violent criminal syndicates operating out of Chicago." Derek choked on a sudden intake of air. He gripped the edge of his table, his eyes darting frantically toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom, calculating his chances of a desperate, panicked escape. I continued ensuring every single syllable was permanently recorded into the official court record. The petitioner, my daughter Victoria, and her husband Derek Sterling did not merely establish these phantom shell companies and secretive offshore banking nodes. They actively funneled this illicit blood money through a tax-exempt domestic philanthropic front, a fake charity explicitly registered under my own personal mailing address, a fake charity named the Patricia Caldwell Memorial Fund, a collective. Horrified gasp echoed from the small gallery. Even Victoria's cowardly lawyer looked genuinely sickened by the profound moral depravity of the crime. I turned my body slowly, locking my gaze directly onto Victoria. My eyes were entirely devoid of any remaining paternal affection. They were cold, dead, and entirely merciless. They deliberately weaponized the sacred, pristine memory of my late wife. I told the silent courtroom. They used the name of a woman who spent her entire life protecting innocent, battered children to aggressively wash millions of dollars in violent mob revenue purely to save Derek's failing commercial real estate firm from total catastrophic bankruptcy. Victoria finally shattered. The flawless, arrogant facade completely crumbled, revealing the desperate, terrified coward hiding underneath. She slammed her hands down onto her table, tears of pure, unadulterated panic streaming rapidly down her face. She screamed across the courtroom, her voice shrill and echoing wildly off the high ceilings. "Where did you get that? You are insane. You are completely delusional. You made all of this up to ruin us." Her desperate, screaming accusations hung in the air, a pathetic final attempt to cling to the original narrative of my supposed mental decay. I did not raise my voice to match her hysteria. I did not need to. The quiet, absolute truth was a far more devastating weapon than any loud, frantic lie. I reached into the very bottom compartment of my black briefcase and slowly withdrew a single stark white folder. It contained the absolute final strike. I held the pristine white document high in the air, ensuring everyone in the room could clearly see the heavy black text printed across the top of the page. The silence in the courtroom became absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating stillness, completely devoid of any movement or sound, save for the frantic, ragged breathing of my terrified daughter. I looked directly into Victoria's panicked, tear-filled eyes. My voice was low, but it resonated with a chilling, echoing finality that seemed to drop the temperature in the entire room by 10 degrees. "Am I insane, Victoria?" I asked softly the question, cutting through the heavy air like a razor-sharp blade. Am I completely delusional for discovering that my own biological daughter legally authorized my murder to quickly pay off her husband's violent gambling debts? I tossed the stark white document onto the polished table right in front of her trembling hands. It was the forged medical proxy and the legally binding do not resuscitate order she had secretly submitted to the regional hospital network. I turned back to face the pale, trembling judge, my voice rising once again to fill the grand courtroom. The petitioner did not bring me here today to compassionately secure my safety or manage my simple utility bills. Your Honor, I declared, my tone ringing with absolute undeniable conviction. She brought me here to finalize a hostile takeover of my 50-acre farm, which was recently valued at $30 million due to a classified state infrastructure project. She actively planned to force the sale of my sacred land, collect the massive government payout, and instantly satisfy the violent cartel holding a loaded gun to her husband's head. And if that lengthy legal process took too long, this forged advance directive ensured that a simple fatal slip of poison into my morning coffee would appear entirely natural, and the attending paramedics would be legally barred from saving my life. Victoria stared down at the forged DNR order resting on the table before her. She was completely paralyzed, unable to formulate a single cohesive thought. She had constructed an elaborate, highly calculated maze of deception and betrayal, and I had just detonated a massive bomb perfectly in the center of it, destroying every single wall she had carefully built. The annihilation of her criminal empire was absolute, devastating, and entirely complete. The sheer weight of the evidence crushed whatever remaining hope Derek had harbored. Panic, raw and unadulterated, finally broke through his paralyzed stupor. He bolted from his chair, his expensive shoes slipping slightly on the polished marble floor. He did not look at his wife. He did not look at his attorney. His only thought was self-preservation. He sprinted toward the heavy oak double doors at the back of the courtroom, desperate to escape the collapsing walls of his criminal empire. He reached out his hands, slamming flat against the wood, pushing with all his remaining strength. But the doors did not budge. Instead, they were pulled open from the outside. Derek stumbled backward, his momentum completely broken. Standing in the doorway, forming an impenetrable human wall, were 4 armed United States federal marshals. Their dark tactical gear sharply contrasted with the formal wood paneling of the courtroom. Benjamin Carter had done his job flawlessly. The trap was not just legal, it was physical. The lead marshal stepped forward, his expression stern and unyielding. He grabbed Derek by the shoulder, spinning him around and slamming him hard against the heavy wooden doors. The sharp metallic click of steel handcuffs echoed loudly, cutting through the stunned silence of the room. Derek let out a pathetic whimpering gasp, his knees buckling as the reality of his lost freedom finally washed over him. At the petitioner table, Victoria watched her husband being restrained. Her perfectly crafted facade was entirely gone. She was trembling violently, her breathing erratic and shallow. 2 more federal marshals bypassed the gallery and approached her. The arrogant attorney quickly stepped out of their way, pressing his back firmly against the wall, silently, praying he would not be swept up in the federal indictment. The marshals firmly grasped Victoria by her arms, pulling her up from her leather chair. As the cold steel cuffs snapped around her delicate wrists, the sheer gravity of her situation finally shattered her completely. Victoria dropped heavily to her knees, the harsh impact echoing across the marble. She did not care about her ruined designer dress or the watchful eyes of the gallery. She looked up at me, her face streaked with ruined makeup and genuine desperate tears. "Dad!" she screamed, her voice cracking with raw hysteria. "Dad, please! I am your daughter. You cannot do this to me. You cannot let them take me away. We can fix this. I am your little girl. Please stop them." I walked slowly around the respondent table, stopping just a few feet away from where she knelt on the floor. I looked down at the weeping, pathetic creature, begging for mercy. I searched my heart for any lingering trace of paternal affection, any small spark of forgiveness. There was absolutely nothing. The space where my love for her used to reside was now a cold, empty void, sealed shut by her own ruthless betrayal. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with a quiet, lethal calm that carried across the breathless courtroom. "You are not my daughter," I said, my words dropping like heavy stones. "My daughter died the moment you decided to poison my dog and forge my execution papers. You looked me in the eyes and told me the best gift I could ever give you was to permanently disappear from your family." I stared into her weeping eyes, offering absolute zero empathy. "Enjoy federal prison, Victoria. I am officially granting your final wish." I turned my back on her agonized sobbing and gave a firm nod to Judge Montgomery. He nodded back, a silent acknowledgement between two men who deeply understood the heavy, uncompromising price of justice. I picked up my empty black leather briefcase and walked straight down the center aisle. I did not look back as the marshals dragged my treacherous bloodline out of the courtroom and into the dark abyss of the federal penal system. I pushed through the front doors of the courthouse, stepping out into the bright, blinding sunlight of the late morning. The cool breeze hit my face, carrying the fresh scent of freedom and absolute closure. The invisible chains that had weighed down my shoulders for the past 3 weeks were completely gone. I walked to my truck, placed the briefcase on the passenger seat, and drove the long, quiet road back to my sanctuary. When I pulled into the gravel driveway of the farm, a beautiful sight awaited me. Buster was sitting on the wooden porch. Thanks to Dr. Wallace, he had fully recovered from the poison. My loyal golden retriever barked joyfully, his tail wagging with pure, unadulterated happiness as I stepped out of the vehicle. I knelt down on the gravel, burying my face in his soft fur, finally allowing a single quiet tear of relief to fall. Later that afternoon, I sat at my heavy oak dining table. I spread out a new set of legal documents Benjamin had prepared for me. I picked up my favorite fountain pen and signed my name with strong, deliberate strokes. I officially transferred the entire 50-acre property, all $30 million of its appraised value, into an irrevocable, untouchable wildlife trust in Patty's name. No greedy developer, no corrupt politician, and certainly no treacherous family member would ever be able to lay a single finger on this sacred earth. It belonged to nature and to my wife's beautiful memory for the rest of time. I carried a steaming hot cup of dark roast coffee out to the rustic front wooden port. I sat down in my wooden rocking chair, listening to the gentle rustle of the wind blowing through the ancient oak trees. Buster rested his heavy golden head gently upon my worn leather boots. The war was over. The monsters were locked away. I took a slow sip of my coffee, looking out over the endless green pastures, and for the first time in years, I was completely and truly at peace. If this harrowing story of ultimate betrayal teaches us anything, it is that absolute greed can blind even the people we trust the most. Blood does not automatically guarantee loyalty, and family ties should never be a shield for malicious abuse. True love and respect are earned through consistent actions, not demanded through entitlement. When someone shows you they value money over your well-being, believe them the first time. Setting firm, uncompromising boundaries is not an act of cruelty. It is the highest form of self-respect. Never let anyone, even family, manipulate you into becoming a silent victim. If you found strength in this story, please hit that subscribe button and tell me your thoughts in the comments below.